All right, everybody, welcome back. So in our last step, we finished our application, right? Look at this thing. It's all fully laid out and designed. Of course, it's really not finished yet. These properties we have here, these UI controls, they don't actually do anything, and they're not tied to any variables yet. So we're going to tie those to variables. We're going to kind of make a centralized data model right now in this step. And then in the next step, we're actually going to make these controls actually do the thing we expect them to do. We're going to wire up our application fully. But for now, we're just going to have a centralized data model, which is going to populate everything we need to populate. And we're also going to explore what's called reactive properties, and we're going to learn about what they can do for us. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is head over to our application component, our app.js file. And of course, we moved out all our HTML and CSS to different files so we can focus on the logic of our application component here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a constructor, and this constructor is going to contain and set a bunch of properties that are relevant to our application here. We're going to have the image that we're using to feed in and generate our halftone, the shape type, the spread, invert, and some colors. And then in our application component markup, or our app.html.js here, we can replace all of these parameters or these attributes with our new variables. And so you can see here, our halftone SVG is rendering with the same parameters we just added to our application.js in the constructor here. So what does this look like now? Because we did change some things, so our halftone is rendering with green hexagons, and so we know these attributes are flowing through, so that's perfect. Now back in our application markup, our app.html.js, let's just start populating other components with the same parameters. Now, of course, the side panel just needs everything we can give it because it has so many controls. The floating header, actually, we just care about the image in there. It's just controlling the image. So, and like I said, our side panel is just going to have so much in it. Let's just do the legwork of putting all these properties in right now. We'll start with the shape type in the picker as its value, and the slider is going to control our spread, or our distance between shapes. Now the invert pattern's a little interesting here. So our invert, if we look back at our app.js here, the invert is actually a Boolean. It's true or false. As we implement our Boolean here, our switch is also true or false, and it takes, instead of a value, it takes a checked attribute. And the checked, if it's present, it's going to be checked. If this attribute is not present, it's not going to be checked. And the way we control that is with this operator right here, this question mark. And so if what we're feeding it here, scope.invert, evaluates to true, the checked attribute is going to be present. And if it evaluates to false, it's going to not be present. And that's what this little question mark does right here. Now, for now, I'm going to skip over the tabs. We'll get back to those later, but we're going to add a color of the halftone color to our color slider and our color area here. And the nifty thing about the slider and the color area, they all can operate on this color attribute, and they can kind of work together to allow you to pick one color. And again, on these tabs, the tabs will allow you to pick whether you're putting the color on the halftones themselves or the background. And we don't have that in place just yet, so this is why I'm cheating a little bit and just saying everything's going to be operating on the halftone color for now in this step. Now, as we reload this, you'll see that the side panel here, it just doesn't have those values populating the UI yet. And there's a good reason for that. They're not in the constructor, and they're not tied to the original application component. But this is going to be cool because we're going to use some of the I guess, magical features of reactive properties. So what is a reactive property, you might ask? Well, let's turn over to app.js, our application component. We'll just add our reactive properties right here. And this is definitely a lit thing. So we're basically telling lit what reactive properties we want to have. And so we're telling it we're going to have shape type, spread, invert, background color. All of these things match the variables we set up here and defined. We're also telling it what type of property it is, what type of variable it is. And so our shape type is a string, our spread or size is going to be a number, and we have a Boolean. So we've just defined our reactive properties here. If this.image gets changed by us through code, through JavaScript, what's going to happen is lit's going to be watching that change, and it's going to trigger another render. And so all of our markup is going to maybe be re-rendered. And when I say maybe, it's because that lit is only going to re-render what's been changed. So it's going to re-render this attribute right here. It's going to re-render this attribute right here. But since nothing else changes when you change this image property, everything else is going to be left alone. Now note I did say it's going to change when you change the property through JavaScript. Well, what about attributes? Well, there's a nice little feature for that, and that's called reflection. So let's try this. I'm going to reflect the shape type, and I'll reflect the halftone color, and I'll reflect the image. So now what do we get from that? Well, let's reload this and find out. And so as we reload this, I'm going to open up my dev tools side by side here, and you'll notice on our HT app component, our application component, it has some new attributes. We didn't add these ourselves. This is what reflection is, or at least half of what it is. So we see that all of the stuff I reflected here, image, shape type, halftone color, we can see these properties right in the attribute here. And that's part of reflection. The other part of reflection is that JavaScript properties, you can change those, yes, and lit watches them. But that does nothing for the attributes. They're two separate things, JavaScript properties and attributes. But it'd be nice if they kind of cooperated together. And without lit, you have to do this yourself. You have to watch your attributes or watch your properties and then reflect what those values are on one or the other. And so lit, it very nicely allows us to just say, let's reflect it, let's tie these together, and lit takes care of all that stuff for us. And so now watch what happens when we change our image. So I'm going to use the ISS space station here, and I'm just going to hit enter and commit it. And all of a sudden the image changed because we're changing the attribute and it affects the property, it affects the variable. And so our component changes right away. And we can do the same thing with our shape type. So let's go with triangles. And maybe we want to change the color to red again. And so this is pretty nice. Lit is not only watching these properties, but also watching the attributes and kind of treating them all as the same thing. Now, I actually don't need these attributes reflected in my main application component, unless we want to do what we just did, whereas go to our dev tools and change what we need to change. So I'm not going to reflect them, but we're still going to leave it such that the properties are still watched. So let's move over to something easy like our floating header, where it just has that image, and we're going to add some of those reactive properties there, or one of the reactive properties, because that's all we need. And we're using this reactive property to change like a blue selection border around our image so we know what's being selected. And over in our floating header.html in our markup here, I'm going to add an attribute. I'm going to add the attribute of selected. And here we have the other question mark, that Boolean attribute here. And so if the photo that we're rendering equals scope.image, our current image from the data model, the selected attribute is going to be on. And if this doesn't evaluate to true, if it's a different thing, then this selected attribute does not get added. And now in our floating header.css, we can give it a little bit of a treatment. So our buttons, they will have some border. I'm gonna make this border really huge so we can see it at first. So the border is gonna be 6 pixels. It's gonna be a solid, transparent border to start off with. But when it has that selected attribute, the border color is going to be this CSS var from Spectrum Web Components that is just a standard blue. And as we reload, of course, we see that, look at that, our 6 pixel huge border is around the currently loaded image. And when we open our dev tools here, we can see that, okay, the image attribute is astronaut.jpg. We didn't reflect it, but it exists just because we've already added it as an attribute in our HTML markup, right, in our application component. And also, even though we didn't reflect, there's enough magic here to say we can change this attribute to iss.jpg, and it's going to switch our thumbnail to the ISS space station. So now that we've seen that in action, I'm going to change our border back to something that's a little less chunky, 2 pixels, a little more subtle. And now let's just do the same thing with our side panel here, where all our components live. So sidepanel.js, we're going to add our reactive properties here for shape, type, spread, etc. Again, they're all going to match what we've listed in the constructor here. And then in our app.html.js, we're passing all that stuff into the side panel right here. And so again, we're just making what we're passing in as attributes into reactive properties here. And look at that. When we reload here, all of our reactive properties that we've just added are making their ways into the values of all of our UI components in the side panel. So our shape type matches hexagons, our spread is 14 here, our invert is off, and our color is green. So this is great. And like I said, in the next step, even though we have a complete visual design here, everything's laid out properly, our properties are flowing through everywhere we need it to, including the selection image up here, we can't actually change anything yet. So this is going to be the next step. We're actually going to start, in the next step, we're going to start making this come together like a real application that you can actually interact with.